Welcome everyone to Letters to the Corinthians, Lesson 5, where in this lesson we're going to be taking a look at 1 Corinthians chapter 7, which chapter 7 is one of the three longest chapters in the book of 1 Corinthians. First Corinthians chapter 7 begins with, "Now concerning the things whereof you wrote to me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. Nevertheless, because of sexual immorality, let each man have his own wife, and let each woman have her own husband." Here begins the second half of the body of this letter as Paul turns to take up the issue about which the Corinthians had written to him. This little phrase here, "now concerning the things of which you wrote to me," is just one of the reasons why 1 Corinthians is my favorite New Testament book. This phrase sort of throws a wrench in the sprocket of a common misconception when it comes to inscripturation, that is, the writing of Scripture by inspiration. Too often, people, Pentecostals and non-Pentecostals, understand 2 Timothy 3:16, all Scripture is given by inspiration of God, to mean that somehow the biblical authors were uncontrollably possessed by the Spirit, or that the term describes a divine dictation as if the human authors were simply a tool, like a pen, through whom the Spirit wrote. Most evangelical scholars reject the notion of divine dictation based upon the biblical author's distinctive writing styles and grammatical nuances. If the New Testament authors were merely spirit possessed stenographers, one would expect no variance in styles, compositions, and vocabulary, which readily occurs in the biblical text. It's weird. It's like we somehow think that any human element to writing scripture takes away from the inspiration of the text, when in fact we just need to realize that inspiration includes various literary concepts like interviewing eyewitnesses of events, which is what Luke chapter 1, verses 1 through 2, and Acts 1, 1 through 3 mentions. It includes responding to letters, as in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and 2 Thessalonians 2 and 2. Inspiration would also incorporate the use of scribes in the physical writing of the text. Romans 16:22, Tertius, Paul's scribe. 1 Peter 5:12, Silas as Peter's scribe. And then this is also alluded to in 1 Corinthians 16:21, Galatians 6:11, Colossians 4:18, and Philemon 19. Inspiration may have even included relying upon other New Testament writings as source material or templates. Take, for instance, the Synoptic Gospels and how many scholars believe that Matthew and Luke used Mark's Gospel as a template for their Gospels. Ephesians and Colossians, these are often called the twin epistles, where Paul may have used a template for each or one epistle as a template for the other. And then Peter and Paul. Peter in 1 Peter chapter 3, drawing inspiration from Paul's teaching on women and adornment in 1 Timothy chapter 2. So getting back to the text, Paul says, "Now concerning the things of which you wrote to me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman." So the question raised here is this statement I have in red fonts a Corinthian slogan? In other words, for modern English grammar, should we put this statement in quotes like it came from the Corinthians to Paul, or is this Paul's statement? Now, as with most topics, you'll find various interpretations, but the majority of commentators over many, many years have understood this phrase as a quotation from the Corinthian letter. Anthony Thistleton points out that this explanation goes all the way back to Origen in the 3rd century. David Garland, in his Baker exegetical commentary, offers some proofs as to why understanding "it is good for a man not to touch a woman" reflects a Corinthian quotation and not a Pauline directive. He states several arguments can be mustered to support interpreting 7:1b as a quotation from the Corinthians letter. The first relates to the use of the phrase peride, "now concerning." This phrase appears 5 other times in the letter, and in each instant it alerts the listeners that one topic has ended and a new one is taken up. So we have the virgins in chapter 7, verse 25, idle food in chapter 8, verse 1, spiritual gifts in chapter 12, verse 1, the collection in chapter 16, verse 1, and then Apollos' return in chapter 16, verse 12. Paul specifically connects the next topic he will discuss to what they wrote in their letter. It is likely that they wrote him about a number of things, and it is also likely that he would identify specifically the subject from their letter that he will discuss before proceeding to offer his judgment. Since this is the first time taken up by Paul from this letter, it makes sense that he would clue them in on what point he is going to address rather than abruptly declare what is good. They, unlike the modern reader who has no access to the letter, would readily recognize the use of their own language. It is reasonable to regard peri de formula as introducing a direct quotation or paraphrase from the Corinthian letter that serves as a subject heading for the sections: sexual asceticism and marriage. The pattern of citing a catchphrase and then immediately rebutting it appears in chapter 6, verses 12 through 13, chapter 8, verses 1 through 4, and in chapter 10, verse 23. So Paul's strategy in this chapter, as in chapter 8, seems to be to start his argument by quoting a Corinthian position as if he agrees with it, and then to add a strong qualification to its use. Thus, after Paul cites the Corinthian slogan, "It is good for a man not to touch a woman," he responds, "Nevertheless, because of sexual immorality, or as the King James Version puts it, to avoid fornication, let each man have his own wife, and let each woman have her own husband." Now, Paul doesn't necessarily negate the statement that it is good for a man not to touch a woman, because later on, Paul is going to advocate celibacy and the single life to us, to certain people because of their current persecutions or distress. Now, something very interesting that Gordon Fee and Anthony Thistleton and David Garland and other commentators point out is that the context here is probably not talking about not being married, but celibacy in marriage. For one, the words for man and woman in Greek, aner and gene, are the exact same words for husband and wife. Garland points out that the verb to have was also used as a euphemism for having sexual intercourse. Take, for example, the Septuagint of Exodus chapter 2, verses 1 through 2, Deuteronomy 28:30, Isaiah 13:16, and then in the New Testament, Matthew 14:4, Mark 6:18, Mark 12:33, and John 4:18. The immediate context with the reminders about what is owed in marriage, the assertions that husbands and wives have authority over another's body, and the command not to deprive one another, makes clear that the phrase, "let each one have his own wife or her own husband," refers to sexual relations within marriage, not getting married. Paul later discusses marriage for those who are single, but here he enjoins couples to fulfill their marital obligations to one another to avoid any danger that partners with celibacy suddenly thrust upon them might seek to satisfy their sexual urges in illicit ways. 1 Corinthians 7 3 through 4 says, "Let the husband render to his wife the affection due her, and likewise also the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. And likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does." Gordon Fee comments, "In two balanced pairs of sentences, now marked by a chiasm," see here again, we're talking about chiasms as we mentioned in a previous lesson. In two balanced pairs of sentences, now marked by chiasm, Paul elaborates on verse 2 that having one's own spouse means full mutual sexual relations. The sentence emphasizes two things. Number one, that sexual relations are due within marriage because, number two, the body is not one's free possession but belongs to one's spouse. Although one can make sense of these two emphases in the traditional view because of the temptation to immorality, marriage must be fully sexual. They are especially understandable if Paul is responding to the rejection of the marriage bed on the part of some. The language of obligation, literally, the payment of what is due, implies that married couples are indebted to one another sexually. Such language has often been found offensive, both by the ascetics, who sees abstinence as a higher good, and the liberated person who sees obligation as a demeaning way to speak of such relationship. This usage, however, is to be explained in light of verse 5, where some are in fact depriving their spouses of sexual relations. So, this is probably a good place to plug a book that I'll be citing a little later in this lesson. It's written by an apostolic author, one of my best friends, John C. Carroll, who pastors in Ohio. Your supplemental reading for this week is a written debate Brother Carroll had several years ago on 1 Corinthians 7:15, not under bondage. But since that debate, Brother Carroll has also written a book on the subject of divorce and remarriage, one of the very few books on the subject of divorce and remarriage written by an apostolic author, I might add. In 2022, I gave a presentation at the UGST Symposium on Life in a Blender, Blended Family Ministries. There were 50 to 60 plus attendees in that presentation, including various UPCI ministers and Urshan College professors. I opened the presentation by asking the crowd how many had either taught or heard a lesson on divorce and remarriage in their local congregations, and barely 5 people raised their hands. Then I asked how many of them were either members of or knew of a blended family in their local congregation, and every hand in the room went up. You even heard some people gasp at the utter unbalance of teaching on divorce and remarriage in our apostolic churches when divorce and remarriage has never been uncommon in society or the church. Anyway, Brother Carroll uses Exodus 21:10 as one of the fundamental passages in his book and how it very much relates to 1 Corinthians chapter 7 verses 3 through 4, and that is the obligation to fulfill your spouse's need for food, clothing, and quote, marriage rights, or as the New Living Translation puts it, sexual intimacy. These are not simply expressions of love, but they are marital obligations. And so Paul's statement in 1 Corinthians 7 3 through 4 that a wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband, and the husband does not have authority over his body, but the wife, reflects a type of mutual accountability between husband and wife, which really relates to the facts that marriage consummated by intercourse is in fact a one flesh union. Now, keep in mind that mutual accountability does not necessitate mutual submission. This is a common misconception, especially when it comes to the woman preacher issue, that husband and wives are to be mutually submitted to one another, which is grammatically and contextually incorrect. Likewise, the Bible does not teach mutual submission between husband and wife. In fact, the very idea of mutual submission in marriage is nonsensical, if not a contradiction in terms. I mean, what can it mean to say that there are two heads of a marriage, each of one which submits to the other's authority? While Paul teaches mutual accountability between husband and wife, the apostle never instructed mutual submission. So egalitarians, those who believe in mutual submission, they misunderstand Ephesians 5:21, submitting to one another to teach mutual submission between a husband and a wife mentioned in the verses that follow. However, The participle submitting grammatically coordinates with the preceding participles in chapter 5, verses 19 through 20, speaking, singing, making melody, and giving thanks, indicating mutual submission among believers. Now, mutual submission among believers works because no believer is the head of another believer. Christ reigns as the head of the church. Thus, Paul's words in Ephesians 5:21 roughly equate to his command in Galatians 5:13 for believers to serve one another in love. The biblical principle of a wife submitting to her own husband is not a result of the judgment of sin in Genesis 3:16. The New Testament teaches repeatedly that the husband's authority over his own wife is due to the order of creation before the fall of man. Egalitarians casually overlook this point. In 1 Corinthians chapter 11 verse 3, Paul bases the head of a wife is her husband upon the fact that God created woman for the man and out of the man, talking to Adam, and that Paul taught that a wife should submit to her own husband because the husband is the head of the wife. Once again, the basis for this is not the judgment of Genesis 3:16, but the creative narrative of Eve being out of Adam's flesh and bone, and that in marriage a man should be joined unto his wife, and they two should be one flesh. So, this fact of mutual accountability, that the wife does not have authority over her body, but the husband, and the husband does not have authority over his body, but the wife, manifests itself in the concept of marital sexual relations. 1 Corinthians 7 5 through 7 states, do not deprive one another except with consent for a time, that you may give yourselves to fasting and prayer, and come together again so that Satan does not tempt you because of your lack of self control. But I say this as a concession, not as a commandment. For I wish that all men were even as I myself. But each one has his own gift from God, one in this manner and one in that manner. Blomberg points out that do not deprive in verse 5 should probably read stop defrauding. That is, cheating someone else out of what is properly his or hers. The only exception Paul will tolerate is if both partners agree that for a very limited time they will abstain from sex for the sake of some unusually concentrated period of communion with the Lord. But even this, Paul says only by way of concession. He never insists that married people abstain at all from sex with each other. And then in verse 7, it offers the first hint of what verse 8 will make explicit. Paul is currently single and wishes that all could share his enjoyment of singleness, but realizes that only some have that gift while others are gifted for marriage. 1 Corinthians 7 8 through 9 says, but I say to the unmarried and to the widows, it is good for them if they remain even as I am, but if they cannot exercise self control, let them marry. For it is better to marry than to burn with passion. Now, notice here that Paul refers to the unmarried and widows. The term unmarried doesn't necessarily demand never married. Now, it can mean never married, as Paul uses the term in verse 34 to describe the differences between a wife and a virgin. But in verse 11, Paul also uses the term unmarried in relation to divorce. Now, Blomberg says that in the context of 1 Corinthians 7 and 8, the fact that unmarried is masculine plural and widows is a feminine plural, that it's probably best to understand unmarried in verse 8 as describing what we would call widowers, especially since there wasn't a specific Greek word for widower in the first century. However, Roy Ciampa and Brian Rosner in their commentary They state that the argument is unconvincing because the word unmarried or agamos may be employed to refer to any person who is not presently married, including never married, divorced, or widowed. And the context of verse 8 is ambiguous as reflected by the translations that simply render this as unmarried. They go on to say that Paul does not always deal in parallel terms with men and women in each category discussed in chapter 7. Now, personally, I think that by unmarried in verse 8, given its close association with widows, that Paul is probably talking about widowers. But I think the bigger grammatical point here that Ciampa and Rosner bring to our attention is that unmarried, agamos, is not a rigid term, and that the context determines exactly what agamos or unmarried means in that instance. So in verse 8, unmarried can very well denote male widowers, and in verse 11, unmarried, same term, can describe somebody in divorce, and then again in verse 34, unmarried, same term, can reflect a virgin who has never been married. The Greek language is nowhere near as rigid as we Americans like to think, and in fact, the English language is not as rigid as we try to act like sometimes. 1 Corinthians 7:10 through 11 says, now to the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord. A wife is not to depart from her husband, but even if she does depart, let her remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband, and a husband is not to divorce his wife. Blomberg points out that the parenthetical statement, yet not I, but the Lord, alludes to words actually spoken by Jesus during his earthly ministry. Now, while Blomberg specifically mentions Mark 10:11 through 12, which I have here on the slide, this does not reflect Christ's only teaching on divorce and remarriage, which is not so much the purpose of this lesson, but to be honest academics, we do need to acknowledge that Matthew 19:9 does include what's commonly called the exception clause. Whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery. And so the antithesis to this statement would be whoever divorces his wife for sexual immorality and marries another does not commit adultery. So Brother Carroll comments here on 1 Corinthians 7:10 through 11 that the idea is divorce between two believers without a valid cause. 1 Corinthians 7:12 through 13, but to the rest I, not the Lord, say, if any brother has a wife who does not believe, and she is willing to live with him, let him not divorce her. And a woman who has a husband who does not believe, if he is willing to live with her, let her not divorce him. So by the phrase, to the rest I, not the Lord, refers to a situation that Jesus did not specifically address in his earthly ministry. And that is the concept of believers being married to unbelievers. Blomberg expounds with all the new converts in Corinth, there were no doubt many couples in which only one of the two had become a Christian. Some believers seem to have feared that sexual relations with an unbeliever would defile them. Paul disagrees and insists that if the unbelieving partner is content to stay, the believer must not initiate divorce. Here he can cite no word of the earthly Jesus, but relies directly on his own sense of how God is guiding or inspiring him. 1 Corinthians 7:14, for the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean, but now they are holy. Verse 14 supplies the rationale for Paul's insistence on preserving the marriage. Here, Paul's justification is laid out in another chiastic ABBA pattern. A brother, a Christian man, who has an unbelieving wife, is not to divorce. B, a believing wife who has an unbelieving husband is not to divorce. Then the follow up B, for the unbelieving husband has been sanctified in the believing wife. And then the follow up A, and the unbelieving wife has been sanctified in the brother, the Christian man. In other words, there are spin off blessings for the non Christian spouse and children that come from having even one member of the family follow the Lord. Now, sanctified and holy cannot here mean saved, as verse 16 proves. Rather, they refer to the moral and spiritual impact of the life of a believer on the rest of the family, making those other family members set apart in a very special place as God's object of devotion. David Garland further explains that the idea hinges on the two becoming one flesh, cited in 1 Corinthians 6:16, and on God's blessing of marriage. Mixed marriages have the same status as Christian marriages and should not be abandoned. Continuing the marriage accords with God's design for marriage, and it should be hallowed as a sphere in which God's holiness and transforming power operates. 1 Corinthians 7:15 through 16. But, oh my goodness, here we go. We've got an exception to the rule. But if the unbeliever departs, let him depart. A brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases. But God has called us to peace. For how do you know, O wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, O husband, whether you will save your wife? Now, Blomberg doesn't go into much detail in exegeting these verses, which is disappointing. And I think sometimes we like to ignore the simple meaning of these passages because we're afraid that it's going to make us look like we are pro divorce. Well, that makes about as much sense as saying that going to the doctor makes you pro sickness. And I said this in my presentation on blended families, but I've heard many well meaning preachers make off the cuff comments on divorce and say things like, giving up is not the best option, as if divorce equates with giving up. And this is a very poor choice of words to describe divorce because there are many people who have survived divorce that never gave up on their first marriage. The other person did, which is comparable to what Paul describes in 1 Corinthians 7:15 through 16. If the unbeliever departs, let him depart. So, a couple of big questions regarding these two verses are number one, to what is the believer no longer under bondage to if the unbeliever departs? And number two, does depart naturally infer sexual infidelity, like the exception clause in Matthew 19, except for fornication? In your supplemental reading of the Carroll Donahue debate, Brother Carroll states, since he is contrasting the appropriate responses to when an unbeliever leaves a believer and when two believers divorce, not under bondage in such cases must be the believer unbeliever parallel command to that which was given to believers. The response for believers is remain unmarried or be reconciled. But the contrasting command is a brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases. So, what is a brother or sister not under bondage to do when divorced by an unbeliever? They are not under bondage to remain unmarried or be reconciled like the believer is when there is a divorce with a believer. Brother Carroll makes the similar observation in his book on divorce and remarriage. When a believer departed from an unbeliever, the believer was not under bondage. What was the believer not under bondage to? The bondage in the context was to remain unmarried or be reconciled. Believers were under that bondage to each other, but the believer was not under that bondage to an unbeliever. Therefore, when a believer departed, a brother or sister was not under the bondage to remain unmarried or be reconciled. God always sides with his children. God will not hold one of his kids hostage to a pagan, even in marriage. But others argue that not under bondage was not a release to remarry, it was simply a call to peace. But you must see that it is absurd on its face for Paul to tell the believer that they are not under bondage, but that they are still bound to the unbeliever covenantally. One cannot be bound to the marriage and not be under bondage to the marriage at the same time. Now, again, the purpose of this lesson is not to answer all the ins and outs on the divorce and remarriage issue, but more to generate conversation on the subject, especially as it relates to 1 Corinthians 7:15 through 16, and then in verse 28, which we'll deal with in just a bit. I will say that personally, I think Brother Carroll offers a strong argument that not under bondage means that they are no longer under the bondage of the marriage covenant. But just to give you some info from both sides, Gordon Fee's commentary doesn't necessarily see not under bondage as an authorization for remarriage. However, Paul Gardner's commentary in the Zondervan exegetical series does exegete not under bondage as authorizing Christians to remarry. Some who see not under bondage as allowing remarriage contend that an unbeliever's departure necessitates infidelity, which they see as the exception clause of Matthew 19:9, except for fornication, as the only justifiable cause for divorce and remarriage. Now, I'm just going to say this. To me, that is a stretch. There's certainly nothing in a person's abandoning their spouse that demands that there was some sort of extramarital affair going on. Again, Brother Carroll uses Exodus 21:10 through 11, that the obligations of marriage include providing food, clothing, and sexual relations as sort of a foundation of explaining 1 Corinthians 7:15 through 16. 1 Corinthians 7:17 through 24 states, but as God has distributed to each one, as the Lord has called each one, so let him walk. And so I ordain in all the churches, was any called while circumcised? Let him not become uncircumcised. Was any called while uncircumcised? Let him not be circumcised. Circumcision is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing, but keeping the commandment of God is what matters. Let each one remain in the same calling in which he was called. Were you called while a slave? Do not be concerned about it. But if you can be made free, rather use it. For he who is called in the Lord while a slave is the Lord's freedman. Likewise, he who is called while free is Christ's slave. You were bought at a price. Do not become slaves of men. Brethren, let each one remain with God in that state in which he was called. Now, listen, I know this is dorky, but with my weird sense of humor, this pericope has always reminded me of the lyrics from the chorus of the REM song Stand. Stand in the place where you live. Blomberg comments that verses 17 through 24 form a preliminary summary of Paul's argument in chapter 7 thus far and apply it to two analogous situations. In this chapter, or if this chapter does form an ABA pattern, then this paragraph provides not only a summary, but also the central focus of his argument. The main point is stated at the beginning in verse 17, and then we have the middle in verse 20 and the end in verse 24 of the paragraph. And all of this can be kind of paraphrased as, do not be in a hurry to change the external circumstances of your life simply because you have become a Christian. 1 Corinthians 7:25 through 26. Now concerning virgins, I have no commandment from the Lord, yet I give judgment as one whom the Lord in his mercy has made trustworthy. I suppose, therefore, that it is good because of the present distress, that it is good for a man to remain as he is. So, again, with Paul's contrast between no commandment from the Lord and his own judgment, indicates that this is a subject that Jesus did not specifically address in his earthly ministry. In verses 25 through 40, Paul returns to the topic of sex and marriage in response to the pro celibacy faction in Corinth. Paul's recommendation to virgins, those who have never been married, is that it is good for them to remain as they are, which follows on the heels of Paul's abiding in the calling in which you were called illustrations. But Paul gives his reasoning for this opinion as because of the present distress or because of the present crisis. Blomberg mentions how some earlier commentators tried to explain this distress as some sort of persecution or famine in Corinth at that time, but no historical records really point to anything like that. Paul Gardner, however, does mention a famine in the Roman Empire around AD 51, so this may possibly allude to what Paul is talking about. Others see the statement as a reference to the end time woes that will engulf the world, which may allude to an eschatological impending persecution. As we'll see, Paul speaks highly in favor of the single life for the greater good of the kingdom and the work of the Lord. 1 Corinthians 7:27 through 28. Are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be loosed. Are you loosed from a wife? Do not seek a wife. But even if you do marry, you have not sinned. And if a virgin marries, she has not sinned. Nevertheless, such will have trouble in the flesh, but I would spare you. So here is another controversial statement that pertains to the divorce and remarriage issue. What exactly does it mean to be loosed from a spouse? Some appeal to Romans 7 1 through 3 and state that death is the only act that looses a person from their spouse. Well, first of all, Romans chapter 7 doesn't say that death is the only act that looses a spouse from marriage. It's simply an illustration of the death of Christ and a covenant. And not only that, but the word in Romans 7 for loosed is not the same as the word in 1 Corinthians 7. But death of a spouse doesn't even fit the context of 1 Corinthians 7:27 through 28. Otherwise, you'd have Paul saying, are you bound to a wife? Do not seek that she dies. That doesn't make sense at all. Paul Gardner suggests that what Paul is dealing with here is not so much fully consummated marriage, but betrothal, seeing as how Paul in the same breath mentions virgins. However, two important points need to be made to this. Number one, there seems to be a contrast between a person bound to a wife and a virgin, which negates the idea of a betrothal, because from the account of Mary and Joseph, we know that a betrothed woman, even as a virgin, was considered the man's wife. Betrothal is not simply engagement in the form of a verbal agreement like we think of it today. Betrothal in the Old Testament in the first century era was a legal binding contract. The man and woman were legally considered to be husband and wife before the marriage was consummated. So, from a modern perspective, engagement, the whole man gets down on one knee and asks the lady to marry him, and she says yes, is not equivalent to first century betrothal. Betrothal is more comparable with saying your wedding vows. So, for example, if you get married at 10 in the morning, but your honeymoon is not scheduled until later that evening, like 6 at night, you're still legally married at 10 o'clock in the morning. So, the main difference between betrothal and modern marriage ceremonies is the time period between the legal ceremony and the actual consummation of that marriage through sexual intercourse. In the first century, the time between the legal ceremony that binds the man together with his wife as husband and wife and their actual consummation may have been several months to a year, whereas now the time between the legal ceremony and the consummation is typically less than 24 hours. Secondly, as we also learn from the account of Mary and Joseph, even if a man were to try to get out of his betrothal to his betrothed wife, it still requires the legal action of divorce because they were legally married. So even if 1 Corinthians 7:27 through 28 were talking about betrothal, which I totally disagree with, the word loosed would still allude to divorce. Now, I think Gardner and other commentators who suggest that Paul is talking about betrothal are guilty of some serious exegetical gymnastics. Joseph Fitzmyer points out that the perfect tense of the word bound expresses the condition of the marital bond that began in the past and continues to exist, which shows that Paul is speaking about a husband and wife and not merely an engaged couple. Likewise, some English translations also render this passage as talking about marriage and divorce. Now, the older NIV translations rendered this as, "Are you married? Do not seek divorce." Likewise, the New English translation has, "The one bound to a wife should not seek divorce." Now, Mark Taylor in the New American Commentary makes the strong case that bound to a wife and seek not to be loosed refers to marriage and divorce, but then he goes on to say that are you loosed from a wife doesn't necessarily mean are you divorced, but are you unmarried, as if to imply persons who have never been married. But again, this seems like a special pleading to try to work around Paul's next statement, but even if you do marry, you have not sinned. So I think the more balanced view here is to understand that Paul has in mind valid reasons for being loosed or divorced from a spouse, in which if the person remarries, they have not sinned. 1 Corinthians 7:29 through 31. But this I say, brethren, the time is short, so that from now on, even those who have wives should be as though they had none, those who weep as though they had not wept, those who rejoice as though they did not rejoice, those who buy as though they did not possess, and those who use the world as not misusing it. For the form of this world is passing away. Once again, we have these little eschatological implications in Paul's words. The time is short, and the form of the world is passing away. This reflects sort of a realized eschatology in the already not yet aspects of the kingdom and the eschaton. Blomberg comments all Christians should therefore sense an urgency to serving the Lord caused by the uncertainty of the time of the end, after which point it will no longer be possible to win any more people to Christ or to disciple them to maturity. Paul is well aware that distractions of marriage may temper this urgency. So those who choose to wed must not become so preoccupied with their families that they can no longer effectively serve Christ. The same is true with normal human activities, celebrations and wakes, commerce and shopping. All are legitimate endeavors, but all remain fleeting. The Christian should therefore be less involved in the affairs of this world than the non Christian. The balance Paul seeks to achieve leads one writer to label him a worldly ascetic. 1 Corinthians 7:32 through 33. But I want you to be without care. He who is unmarried cares for the things of the Lord, how he may please the Lord. But he who is married cares about the things of the world, how he may please his wife. Now, this doesn't mean that a married man doesn't care about how he can please the Lord. It simply means that he has this added responsibility and obligations of pleasing his wife, which then goes back to the foundation of Exodus 21, providing food, clothing, and sexual relations. Then Paul flips it and makes the same argument from the woman's point of view. There is a difference between a wife and a virgin. The unmarried woman cares about the things of the Lord. that she may be holy both in body and in spirit. But she who is married cares about the things of the world, how she may please her husband. And this I say for your own profit, not that I may put a leash on you, but for what is proper, and that you may serve the Lord without distraction. So again, Paul's point is not that a married woman loves the Lord any less than an unmarried woman, just that being married adds certain necessary distractions to her life. 1 Corinthians 7:36 through 38. But if any man thinks he is behaving improperly toward his virgin, if she is past the flower of youth, and thus it must be, let him do what he wishes. He does not sin. Let them marry. Nevertheless, he who stands steadfast in his heart, having no necessity, but has power over his own will, and has so determined in his heart that he will keep his virgin, does well. So then he who gives her in marriage does well, but he who does not give her in marriage does better. Blomberg mentions two different views as to this pericope. Number one, that it's talking about a father giving away his virgin daughter who has passed the flower of her youth, as the New King James Version states. And number two, that the context is between fiancés. David Garland lists a third view, in that is in the two people who are living in a celibate marriage. So the issue with the different views seems to stem from the phrase behaving improperly toward his virgin. As Blomberg states, it might suggest sexual innuendos that would be inappropriate for a father-daughter relationship. But that doesn't have to be the case here. As Blomberg also cites, the early church, without exception, interpreted these verses as referring to a father giving his older daughter in marriage. Now, what exactly past the flower of youth means is up to speculation. Many years ago, young women in their 20s would have been considered, quote, past the normal age for getting married. Now, in support of this view, the verb for marry in verse 38 means to give in marriage. So David Garland, in his Baker exegetical commentary, he lists 7 different points to negate the father virgin daughter view. Now, a few of these points seem kind of arbitrary, like arguing whether a father's daughter should be described as his virgin. Well, Joseph Fitzmyer actually shows some ancient Greek sources that a man's daughter was indeed called his virgin. Garland also offers some grammatical points, but these must be balanced out against the fact that the early church, who knew the Greek language without exception, held to the father virgin daughter view. Fitzmyer also mentions a slight variation of the father daughter view, in that Paul is describing maybe a guardian and his ward, like an adoptive daughter, or maybe even a master and a slave. This interpretation dates all the way back to John Chrysostom, Theodoret, and Epiphanius. Fitzmyer also points out that the betrothed fiance's view that both Blomberg and Garland affirm wasn't proposed until the late 1800s. So if you would really like a good comparison back and forth between the various views of the 2 or 3 different views on verses 36 through 38, I would recommend comparing David Garland's comments in the Baker Exegetical series with those of Joseph Fitzmyer's comments in the Anchor Bible series. Paul concludes this long response to the marriage question with, a wife is bound by law as long as her husband lives, but if her husband dies, she is at liberty to be married to whom she wishes, only in the Lord. But she is happier if she remains as she is, according to my judgment. And I think I also have the Spirit of God. So Paul reaffirms marriage as a lifelong commitment, but once again acknowledges that Christian widows, and by implication widowers, are free to remarry so long as they marry a fellow believer. But then at the end, it's like Paul gets that little last jab in one last time. It's like, I think it would be better for them to remain unmarried like me. And so I like how Blomberg states that, and I think I also have the Spirit of God, does not reflect any doubt on Paul's part, but represents a slightly sarcastic aside to the Corinthians who felt that they only were the ones who had attained true spiritual insight. So this week's forum discussion will focus on 1 Corinthians 7, 10 through 16, and also verses 27 through 28, and the issue of divorce and remarriage. All opinions are welcome. Discuss your thoughts on 1 Corinthians 7, not under bondage. Is this a Pauline privilege for divorce based on abandonment? Do you think that abandonment necessarily implies infidelity, the Matthew 19:9 exception, except for fornication? Would a divorce in such case permit remarriage? You may even discuss remarriage and the ministry. So make sure you support your thoughts with scripture. And as always, I look forward to conversing with you in the discussion forums. God bless.